Welcome back, everyone, to our 10th deep dive into Danish diplomacy.
10 already.
Can you believe it? Time flies when you're having fun, I guess.
I guess so. What are we diving into today?
Well, as always, this is part of our ongoing series, Diplomacy and International Relations by Bastian Freiburg.
Right.
And a quick reminder for our listeners that this episode, like all the others, is AI generated, but don't worry.
Yeah.
It's meticulously fact-checked by Bastian Freiburg himself, so we can trust the info. Today we're tackling this fascinating paradox, the role of, classic diplomacy in a world that seems to be increasingly defined by, conflict and crisis.
Right.
You know, we're talking about embassies, ambassadors,
Yeah.
negotiations between states, all that formal stuff.
The usual. Yeah.
You might think those skills are kind of irrelevant in a war zone, but
I see where you're going with this.
that's where things get really interesting.
Yeah, it's actually fascinating.
So let's jump right in. Our sources for this deep dive give us a really intriguing look at how Danish diplomacy actually works, both at home and abroad.
Okay, I'm ready.
One quote that really stood out to me was from forwarddiplomaty.pdf. It says, I dag vial diplomater. It translates to, today, we are all diplomats.
Wow. That's thought-provoking for sure.
It is, right? What do you make of that statement?
I think it really highlights how much the landscape of diplomacy is changing, you know?
Yeah.
It's not just for government officials anymore.
So true.
Like, this source points to the royal family,
Okay.
businesses,
Yeah.
even individual citizens.
So basically everyone.
Exactly. Everyone plays a role in shaping Denmark's relationships with the rest of the world.
So Denmark is taking this everyday diplomacy approach.
It seems that way.
But how much impact can individuals really have?
It's definitely a collective effort, for sure. But the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is still the central coordinating body. They make sure Denmark's voice is heard on the world stage.
Right. But this shift, this idea that everyone's involved,
Yeah.
I think it suggests that Denmark is recognizing the importance of a broader approach to diplomacy.
More inclusive.
Exactly.
So are they spreading themselves too thin, or is this like a savvy strategy?
Well, if you look at Denmark's history, it's been committed to multilateral cooperation for a long time, especially since World War II.
That's true.
And their approach to global security challenges really shows this.
Yeah, they're contributing to conflict prevention,
Right.
peacekeeping,
Uh-huh.
peace building,
Yeah.
humanitarian missions. It's not just talk. They're actually sending people and resources and expertise all over the world.
That's right. It's not just diplomats either. We're talking military personnel, police officers, civilian experts, humanitarian aid workers.
Wow.
Denmark steps up in so many ways.
And this commitment is evident in their defense agreements, their government platforms, and their actions within, like the EU, UN, NATO, the OSCE.
All the major players. Exactly. So it's clear Denmark is embracing that team player role on the world stage.
They are.
But how does this multilateral approach actually work when you're dealing with a conflict zone?
That's where our second source, diplomaticikrig.pdf, comes in.
Okay, tell me more about this one.
It gives us a first-hand account of the Danish embassy in Kabul, which opened in 2006.
And Kabul during that time was definitely a conflict zone.
Absolutely.
So this wasn't just like a small diplomatic outpost.
Not at all. By 2013, it had become the second largest Danish embassy,
Wow.
with a staff of 113, including personnel from the Ministries of Defense, Justice,
Oh, wow.
and Foreign Affairs, plus 48 local staff,
That's a significant presence.
especially considering the security situation in Afghanistan at the time.
Exactly.
It really highlights Denmark's commitment to Afghanistan, even in the middle of conflict. They weren't just there for show.
Right.
They were actively engaged on multiple fronts.
So what was daily life actually like for these Danish diplomats working in Kabul? This source paints a pretty intense picture.
It wasn't your typical diplomatic posting. Think bulletproof vests,
Okay.
fragmentation goggles,
Wow.
bodyguards,
Yeah.
and living within a heavily guarded compound.
It's definitely a far cry from the image of diplomats, sipping tea and having polite conversation.
Right. It's a totally different ballgame. Diplomacy in war is a whole other world.
Definitely.
You know, the source actually quotes a British ambassador who described the Kabul embassy compound as a mix of a train station, a schoolyard, and an open prison.
What an interesting combination of images, and kind of unsettling too.
Yeah.
What kind of psychological toll does that take on the diplomats who are living and working in those conditions.
It's got to be tough. The constant threat of attack,
Yeah.
the restricted movement,
Right.
the isolation, it creates this unique pressure, these challenges you wouldn't face in a typical embassy.
Definitely. And then you have the complexity of the work itself. This source actually talks about 5 distinct networks
Yeah.
that a Danish ambassador in Kabul had to navigate.
5. That sounds complicated.
It is. Let's break them down. First, you have the internal embassy environment.
Okay.
The ambassador is responsible for leading a large, diverse team, often under very stressful conditions.
Keeping morale up in that kind of environment must be a challenge all on its own.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's just the first network. Then there's coordinating with the Danish troops in Helmand province, acting as a liaison between the military, humanitarian, and political efforts.
Right, so it's not just about diplomacy with the Afghan government.
It's about coordinating with Danish forces on the ground as well.
Got it. What else?
Then there's the international political community, communicating with key coalition partners, EU, NATO, and UN representatives.
Sounds like a constant juggling act to keep everyone informed and on the same page.
It is. And then we can't forget about the domestic political landscape back in Denmark. The ambassador needs to keep Danish ministries and politicians informed about what's happening in Afghanistan.
Which might not always align with what's being reported back home.
Exactly. That must require a whole other level of diplomacy in itself.
For sure. Is that all 5?
Not quite. The 5th network involves navigating the NGO community.
Ah, that's a tricky one.
It is. The ambassador needs to support their work while maintaining neutrality and also ensuring their safety.
So it's a balancing act on all fronts.
Absolutely.
What does all of this tell us about Denmark's diplomatic strategy in a war zone?
Well, I think these 5 networks highlight a key insight. For Denmark, diplomacy in a war zone is about so much more than just peace talks.
I see that.
They're coordinating this complex web of actors, balancing military, humanitarian, and political goals, all while operating in a high-risk environment.
It's a multifaceted approach.
Very much so. And it requires incredible adaptability and a deep understanding of the local context.
You really have to admire the skills and resilience of these diplomats.
Absolutely. What stands out to you about their approach?
Well, it's clear that hardship postings like Kabul used to be seen as a fast track to career advancement within the diplomatic corps.
Right, like a badge of honor.
Exactly. But this source suggests that that logic has shifted.
Why is that?
Well, there are a couple of reasons. First, the increased rotations in and out of these high-risk environments make it hard to gain the kind of deep experience that used to be associated with these postings.
So it's less about time served and more about managing a constant flow of personnel.
Exactly. And second, the transition to a primarily aid-focused mission in Afghanistan in 2014 really changed the nature of the work.
So it became less about high-stakes political negotiations.
And more about managing development projects.
Which, while important, doesn't necessarily carry the same weight within the diplomatic corps.
Right.
Does this shift reflect a broader trend in Danish diplomacy?
That's a fascinating question, and one we'll explore further in the next part of our discussion. It's interesting, isn't it? This whole idea of these hardship postings not being seen as automatic career boosters anymore.
Yeah, it makes you wonder, like, if the nature of the work is changing, what does it mean for the future of Danish diplomacy as a whole?
That's the big question, right? I mean, Diplomacy.pdf is focused on the Danish experience in Afghanistan, but
Yeah.
it raises these broader questions about diplomacy in conflict zones in general, especially in a world that's increasingly defined by, like, these complex, multifaceted crises.
Definitely. It feels like we're moving away from this traditional idea of diplomacy being all about formal negotiations between states. And we're moving into a more fluid, dynamic reality.
Exactly. Remember that quote we talked about, that we are all diplomats one?
Oh, yeah.
It suggests that to really engage with the world effectively, you need a broader approach. It can't just be government-to-government interactions.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But wouldn't that make it harder to, like, present a unified front on the world stage?
It could.
How does Denmark manage that?
Well, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs still plays that central coordinating role. They ensure some consistency in Denmark's foreign policy.
Okay.
But this shift towards a more inclusive approach to diplomacy, it acknowledges that there are multiple actors involved, multiple perspectives.
So it's about adapting to this changing landscape of international relations.
Exactly. And diplomaticrig.pdf gives us a really fascinating case study of how this adaptation plays out in a high-stakes environment. Like, the Danish experience in Kabul shows that they're willing to engage on multiple fronts, balancing military, humanitarian, and political objectives.
And it sounds like to manage those competing interests, you need a deep understanding of the local context. It's not just about relying on traditional diplomatic protocols.
Absolutely. The source actually highlights how important it is to build relationships with local staff.
Oh, interesting.
They often have the best insights into the complexities of the conflict.
That makes sense.
They're the eyes and ears of the embassy. They provide this crucial cultural understanding and help navigate the nuances of local politics.
So it's almost like everyday diplomacy takes on an even greater significance in a conflict zone.
I think so.
Every interaction matters. Every gesture, every word carries added weight.
It's a high-pressure environment.
For sure.
The stakes are incredibly high. Building trust and fostering communication are essential, not just for achieving, specific objectives,
Right.
but for ensuring everyone's safety and well-being.
It makes you think about the ethical considerations of engaging in diplomacy in a war zone.
Huh?
How do diplomats balance their duty to represent their government with, the moral complexities of operating in a war zone?
That's the question, right? It's a question at the heart of the work diplomats do, especially in these challenging environments.
Yeah.
They're often operating in a gray area. The line between promoting peace and navigating political realities can get blurry.
The source mentioned that the ambassador has a responsibility to communicate with various stakeholders back in Denmark, keep them informed about what's actually happening on the ground. That's got to be a challenge in itself.
Oh, absolutely. Especially when you consider how different the media narrative can be from the lived experiences of those on the front lines.
Exactly.
The ambassador has to find a way to convey the nuances of the situation, the complexity of the conflict, the challenges of working in such a high-risk environment. And they have to do all of that while remaining a credible representative of the Danish government.
It's a tough balancing act.
It is.
And then there's the added complexity of interacting with the NGO community.
Right.
That brings a whole other set of ethical considerations.
The source describes it as this delicate dance.
Mhm.
NGOs are doing such vital work on the ground, providing humanitarian aid, supporting local communities.
Yeah.
But their presence can be seen as a threat by certain actors in the conflict.
Putting them at risk.
Exactly. So how do you navigate that as a diplomat? How do you support these organizations, but also ensure their safety and neutrality?
That's a good question.
It requires a deep understanding of the local context, for sure, strong communication skills, and a willingness to engage with a diverse range of actors.
Many of whom may have competing interests.
Exactly. The Danish experience in Kabul, the way it's described in the source, it highlights how much these hardship postings have evolved.
Right. We talked about how they're not seen as these automatic career boosters anymore.
Yeah.
Especially since the transition to a more aid-focused mission in Afghanistan in 2014.
That's a big turning point. The Danish embassy in Kabul became less about high-stakes political negotiations and more about managing the substantial budget for development projects,
Okay.
making sure the funds are used effectively, coordinating with different stakeholders.
So less about traditional diplomacy, more about a hands-on approach to development and aid.
Exactly. And I think this shift reflects a broader trend in Danish diplomacy as a whole. It's about recognizing how interconnected development, security, and humanitarian issues are.
It's fascinating to see how those different aspects of diplomacy are becoming increasingly intertwined,
It is.
especially in conflict zones, where the lines between traditional diplomatic functions and development work can be so blurred.
Right. It makes you think. What does this evolving landscape mean for the future of diplomacy?
Yeah, what skills will diplomats need to navigate this increasingly complex world? What lessons can we draw from the Danish experience in Afghanistan?
Right.
And how can those insights be applied to other conflict zones and humanitarian crises?
These are all crucial questions, and ones we'll delve into further in the final part of our discussion.
We've been talking about this shift in Danish diplomacy, especially in these conflict zones like Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And it seems like the old ways of doing things, the traditional diplomacy, isn't always enough in today's world.
You're right. Looking at the bigger picture, Danish diplomats are basically being asked to wear so many hats. Diplomat, aid worker, negotiator, cultural mediator. The list goes on.
They're like diplomatic multi-hyphenates, it's true.
Yeah.
But what does this mean for the future of diplomacy, though? What skills are going to be the most important for, the next generation of diplomats?
Well, it definitely raises questions about how we train diplomats and even their mindset. I mean, it's not enough to just know protocol and international law anymore.
Right.
Future diplomats need to be adaptable,
Yep.
resilient,
Yeah.
able to operate in these complex, fluid environments where the lines between war and peace are, well, they're blurry.
They need to be comfortable with ambiguity.
Hmm.
Because in conflict zones, there are rarely easy answers.
Exactly.
It's more about navigating the gray areas and finding common ground, even when it seems impossible.
And it's not just about representing your nation's interests, right?
Yeah.
It's about understanding everyone's perspective, finding ways to bridge the divides.
Yeah.
It takes empathy, cultural sensitivity, and a willingness to actually listen and learn.
It sounds like the future of diplomacy is less about, like, making these big formal pronouncements and more about building real connections and fostering understanding.
I think that's a really good point. And this idea of everyday diplomacy, it's not just for diplomats in war zones. It's for all of us.
That's true. That quote, "We are all diplomats," really made me think. Every interaction we have with someone from another culture, it shapes their perception of our country. Do you think, like, most Danes are aware of that?
It's a big responsibility, that's for sure, and one we should all be more mindful of.
Yeah, I think so.
Whether we're traveling, interacting with people from different backgrounds here at home, or even just having conversations online,
Right.
our words and actions, they all make a difference.
So we can all contribute to making a more peaceful, interconnected world, even in small ways.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message, especially now when the world seems so full of conflict and division.
It is. So as we wrap up our deep dive into Danish diplomacy, what's the one thing you hope our listeners will take away from this episode?
I think it's important to remember that diplomacy is not a thing of the past. It's essential for navigating the complexities of the world today.
Absolutely.
The challenges we face, they require global cooperation, understanding, and that's something we all have a part in.
What a great way to sum up this fascinating look at Danish diplomacy. We've gone from the halls of government to the front lines of conflict zones. It's clear that the world of diplomacy is definitely changing,
It's adapting.
evolving,
Yeah.
to meet the demands of a very complex world.
Well said. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep engaging with the world around you.
And thank you all for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time for another exploration of diplomacy and international relations.